is Victor Lopez, and I'm running for New Mexico Court of Appeals. I've been in practice about 28 years. I first became licensed back in the early 80s, and my first job out of law school, I graduated from UCLA School of Law, UC Berkeley undergraduate. My first job, I worked for 2 Court of Appeals judges. Well, one at a time, but first Judge Ramon Lopez. I sent him an article that I had written. I sent him some advance sheets involving the equal protection rights of undocumented aliens, the children, undocumented alien children. It was in prior to the Plyler v. Doe decision out of the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was something that I felt was an important issue to address. But I prepared that and I sent it to Judge Lopez, no relation, but he was happy to see it, and he hired me right on the spot as soon as he received it. And so I was very gratified with that experience, and I accepted his offer. I did go to come back to Santa Fe, and I was there for about a year and a half. I worked for him, then I worked for Judge Alarit once Judge Lopez retired. And that experience, I think, inspired me to seek for that position. I was interested in the Court of Appeals, the variety of issues that came before the court, and I saw how important the issues were and how seriously the Court of Appeals judges addressed the issues that came before the court. And so I subsequently went to work for the Attorney General. I was working with Paul Bartkey for a number of years, and I think some of that is in the profile that I sent over. Here's a copy if you'd like.
Thank you.
And then I went into private practice with Barbara Everidge and Alvin Cantor in Albuquerque, and I worked with them for a number of years, really dealing with a wide variety of issues, ranging from family law, divorces, child support issues, to collections. Some collections work involved going to court, trial, things of that nature. Some property issues, some bankruptcy issues related to some of the collection issues. And so I felt that I was getting a good background, but I felt like I was reinventing the wheel each time, because there was always a new area to practice. And while that was fun, it was a little complicated in terms of the issues. But I got a lot of good experience, and I feel that was an important experience to get early on. And at some point I started focusing my practice on workers' compensation. I met up with a gentleman by the name of Edward Benavides. He was a former workers' compensation judge, and I made a deal with him. I said, I'll come work for you if you teach me some workers' comp law, because I didn't really know much about it at the time. And so then I did go and work with Mr. Benavides, and really enjoyed the practice. I felt like I was making a difference with people's lives. People needed the representation. I spoke Spanish, and so it gave me an additional layer of skill that I could offer to New Mexicans. And there were a lot of Spanish-speaking people who were underserved at the time, and also currently. And so I felt it was something that was very important and unique that I added to the formula. I was Spanish-speaking when I was growing up. It was my first language. I grew up in San Pedro, California.
I'm sorry, what?
I grew up in San Pedro, California, and my first time coming through Las Cruces, I was a young boy, probably about 8 or 9 years old, and we were on our way to visit family in El Paso, and we were going to Carlsbad. So it was my first time in New Mexico, and of course we had a great experience. But then we, of course, we went back home and grew up. Then I went to college, and I met my wife at UCLA School of Law.
You're kind of getting into my next question,
okay.
So I'm going to, because we want to keep these as brief as we can.
Sorry about that.
And I did want to ask you, because it's a little bit more difficult for us doing these than, say, a legislative race, because we can ask about specific bills. Why did you vote this way? Why did you do that?
Sure.
With judges, it's a little bit hard, because you're not supposed to talk about specific cases. And honestly, even if we did, we don't follow the appeals court as closely as we follow city council or the state legislature. So given that, and given that probably most of the voters are that same way, what things would you point them to in terms of your experience, your qualifications, and your background without talking about those specifics, but
Right.
that you think separate you from Ms. Zamora?
Well, I think some of what I've already discussed is an important background, and that is the wide variety of issues that I've dealt with, starting in my early practice, starting also working with the Attorney General's office. I dealt with state federal issues anytime there was a state interest involving whether it was a federal oil and gas lease or a cleanup effort for an environmental issue or a historic preservation issue. These are issues that we dealt with, and I thought that was very important and unique experience that isn't really out there very much, but yet that these issues can get before the Court of Appeals. But also working with Alvin Cantor and Barbara Everett, very important experience in terms of the breadth of my experience dealing with the family law issues as well as the property issues, the collections issues, the many areas that come before the court. And of course my specialization in workers' compensation for many years, and of course now being a workers' compensation judge. Currently there is no workers' comp judge, former workers' comp judge, with the kind of experience that I have and practitioner on the Court of Appeals. And so it's something that is important, it's unique to the working people of New Mexico to have someone on the court that has that kind of experience. But if I had to say, in addition to my experience, another thing that I think is important and that I think the voters should consider is the ethic that I'm following in pursuing public financing to run this race. It's something that I feel that is particularly important. I can't say necessarily that, well, what I can say is normally judges aren't, you're right, normally judges are not supposed to state opinions on issues that could come before them, and this may be one of them, but it is a decision I made early on that this was the right way to run. I ran for this office back in 1996 and we didn't have public financing then. But I think it reflects on the importance, and one of the things I've seen with people around the state is that they're concerned that judges and lawyers and politicians in general, that there's something wrong with the system, and part of that, what's wrong with the system, is the big money influence. And so public financing gets around that. We collected 1,600 $5 contributions throughout the state basically from citizens. You know, we didn't accept any corporate money. In fact, the law doesn't allow corporate money or union money or special interest money of that type. And so I feel very proud of that fact that we have done that and we've qualified for the monies. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Okay.
You've actually anticipated my third question.
Oh, sorry.
Because we had talked about that before. And try to find a new way to ask Ms. Zamora, is she also doing public financing, do you know? Or
she is not.
Ask her
She
tomorrow?
is not.
For those who don't go that route, are you satisfied with the current level of reporting and transparency in that? And
well, I think one of the things that you see is that there is reporting, although the first reporting really occurs for this race. It depends on when you start receiving money, but the first reporting for this was just, I think it was in April. And so, I mean, I started running this race in August. And I think Ms. Zamora did too. I mean, she started early on, not that early, but she did start early on. But,
right.
But that was the first opportunity for her. So we didn't know up to that point what kind of fundraising she was having, and I know she has a lot of other fundraisers. And she does the best she can, and she's a fine person. But I think that even though the judges are not supposed to know who gives them how much, the sad reality is that we as judges, or the judges who pursue that process, the private financing option, do show up to fundraisers, and they talk to the people that show up. Many times lawyers, usually lawyers, and they shake their hands and they thank them for showing up. And even though they're not supposed to know who's giving them what, it's unfortunate that that's the way the process is, and that's what we have to do. And so I don't think it's seemly. I think that the public doesn't think that it's an appropriate way of pursuing it. And I think it's an unfortunate thing, but I think public financing allows us to avoid that process by just limiting the contributions to the $5 instead of the thousands that potentially can be given. And so I guess I hope that answers your question.
My name is Monica Zamora, and I am running for the New Mexico Court of Appeals. I have been a district court judge in Bernalillo County for the past 6.5 years. I was appointed to this position in November of 2005. Prior to that, I had a civil trial practice for over 18 years. And it's actually my experience on the juvenile bench that prompted me to apply for the Court of Appeals position last June when it became available. And I did go through the Judicial Selection Committee, and I was found to be qualified for this particular position. When I talk about my experience on the juvenile bench, this is what prompted me to move forward and look at the Court of Appeals, because no other sitting judge on the Court of Appeals has this experience in juvenile justice, child welfare, or adoption law.
Okay, and as happened with Mr. Lopez yesterday, you kind of bleed into my second question a little bit, but appeals court is, as we talked about with him, and all judges are a little bit more difficult for us because, one, we don't cover it on a day-to-day basis, and two, even if we did, you're limited in what we can't say, why did you vote this way on this case and how would you vote on this case coming up. So looking strictly at the areas of your experience, your qualifications, and your background, what would you say distinguishes you, and what would you like voters to look at when they're trying to make this case between two people that they're probably just meeting for the first time?
I think what distinguishes me from my primary opponent is my extensive experience. As I indicated, I was a civil litigator. I represented individuals, I represented corporations, I represented plaintiffs, I represented defendants, I represented governmental entities in all areas from personal injury, wrongful death, employment law, civil rights litigation, contracts, and also a lot of adoptions. I focused on international and domestic adoptions. So my experience is quite extensive. I've been able to move over to the criminal area by virtue of my appointment to the juvenile bench, because even though it's called juvenile delinquency, we still have to refer to the criminal code as well as the children's code. And also as a sitting judge. I've been in front of the bench as an attorney. I'm sitting now as a district court judge, so I understand the process, and then as the Court of Appeals, I would be reviewing that process.
Okay. And then the last question for the video purposes. One of the issues that has already come up, just because Mr. Lopez elected to take public financing and you elected to go the traditional route of fundraising, is the issue of influence, and when you do have fundraisers and when you do not take the public financing, how do you ensure that people who would potentially be appearing before your court aren't the same ones who are, funding your campaign?
Right. One, the public's confidence in the judiciary is paramount, and each judge has that responsibility to ensure the public's confidence. There is a new judicial code, and whether or not this judicial code was in effect or not, but we are required, whether it's public financing or fundraising, to have a campaign committee. And I'll switch between campaign and finance committee. I tend to call it a finance committee, but under the code it's called a campaign committee. It is their responsibility to do the fundraising. Under the code, I specifically cannot know who has contributed or the amounts that they've contributed. So I rely on this committee to accept what the code calls reasonable donations, and we know that there are caps as well. Ultimately, it's my responsibility, but I have to rely on this committee to do the fundraising on my behalf. In the event that I would find out who or somebody did in particular donate to my campaign, it is my ethical responsibility to recuse myself from their case. I prepare well in advance for my cases. I read every single file that comes before me. So in the Court of Appeals, obviously, it's a more extensive process because you're reviewing the record below. As soon as that case is assigned, I would have the heads up and I would immediately recuse myself. So I don't think there's any concern for the appearance of impropriety and the appearance of influence.